Sometimes I catch myself standing in the middle of a crowded room, invisible. That evening was just like that. A company celebration in a restaurant where the crystal clinked and laughter shimmered over polished tables, but my presence felt more like decoration than substance. I wore a pale silk dress I'd chosen days in advance, hoping its fabric would remind me that I still had skin. My husband declined to come, as he often did for my work events. He had his reasons: deadlines, fatigue, the unspoken belief that such evenings had nothing to do with the real world. He stayed home, fixing a leaky tap in the bathroom, while I circled the room with a glass in hand, wishing the lightness of white wine would make me less aware of my own outline. It's strange. This hunger for notice, not just from men, but from the air itself. Lately, I found myself lingering in front of the closet, brushing my fingertips over lace and soft satin, choosing what I would wear, not just for comfort or propriety, but for the secret pleasure of knowing the fabric would press against my skin all day. The dress tonight was a quiet rebellion, a message only I understood. He noticed. My boss, older than most in the office, sharper in wit and observation. I'd caught him glancing at me during meetings before, those quick, measuring looks, always hidden behind a half-smile or some sardonic comment. Tonight he approached with a glass of whiskey and the relaxed confidence of someone at home in his own skin. He didn't ask about work. He asked, "Do you ever get tired of these performances?" It was the first honest question I'd heard all evening. I answered too quickly, maybe too eagerly. "It's all theater, isn't it?" His laughter was dry, like paper sliding across a desk. Somehow, in the swirl of the party, our conversation found its own corner, first standing by the bar, then drifting to the veranda as the city pressed, in outside, warm with late summer. I don't remember what stories I told him, something about my childhood, the way my mother taught me to set a table, how I always felt responsible for keeping things pleasant. He listened, really listened, in a way my husband rarely did anymore. He asked me if I missed being surprised. The question clung to me, like perfume in my hair, as I rode home alone in a taxi. I studied my reflection in the window, the night, dissolving around my face. Did I miss surprise? I didn't know. My life was a gentle script, each scene carefully arranged, but lately, every gesture felt like a borrowed line. At home, my husband was asleep on the couch, television flickering. I slipped out of my dress, letting it fall in a soft pool at my feet, the cool air grazing my bare shoulders. For a moment, I stood there, noticing how the silk left faint marks on my skin, like memory pressed into flesh. I lingered in the bathroom, brushing my teeth longer than necessary, listening to the quiet pulse of water through the pipes. In the mirror, I searched for signs of change, some secret blooming behind my eyes. There was nothing dramatic, no wild longing, no dangerous thrill, just a low, persistent ache, as if something in me had remembered how to want. I pulled on my favorite nightgown, one that hugged my body just enough, and slipped under the covers beside my husband. His arm twitched in his sleep, brushing my thigh, and I realized how long it had been since I'd craved that touch. I lay awake, replaying fragments of conversation, the boss's wry smile, the way he said special, as if testing the word on his tongue. I wondered what it would be like to be seen again, not as an ornament, but as a woman with her own story, her own hunger. My thoughts drifted to the office, to the memory of laughter in the night air, and I drifted into uneasy sleep, unsure whether I'd dreamed that evening or lived it. But the echo of his question, "Do you miss being surprised?" would not leave me. It followed me into the morning, where, beneath my ordinary clothes, I chose the lace underwear, just for myself, and felt, for the first time in months, a flicker of anticipation that had nothing to do with routine. The next days unfolded in their usual cadence, but something in the air had shifted. I moved through the routines of my marriage like a dancer repeating old steps. A kiss on the cheek in the morning, breakfast set with quiet precision, the empty space across the table where conversation used to live. My husband hummed absently as he read the news, eyes darting across the headlines, only occasionally glancing in my direction. I noticed, almost with scientific detachment, how distant we'd become in the small gestures, the way our hands never met in the hallway, how our laughter never quite overlapped at the dinner table. Work, at least, pulsed with urgency. There was a big deadline approaching, a project everyone in the office was either dreading or pretending not to dread. It meant late hours, too much coffee, and the brittle camaraderie of people who have learned to survive on the edge of exhaustion. I buried myself in spreadsheets and proposals, grateful for the noise that kept me from listening to the quieter, more dangerous questions circling in my mind. It was a Thursday nearly midnight when I realized I was the last one left in the office. The lights beyond my glass wall had dimmed to blue halos, city traffic thinning out until it sounded like distant surf. I was packing up, jacket over my arm, when his voice floated from the doorway. "Still here?" It was him, the boss, smiling, but with a tiredness that felt genuine. He stepped into the glow of my desk lamp, shadows settling in the lines of his face. "Someone's got to make sure this company doesn't collapse overnight," I said, trying for levity, but my voice caught at the end. He didn't laugh, only watched me for a moment with that unsettling stillness of his. Then, without another word, he offered me a mug of fresh coffee, its aroma dark and sharp in the hush. We sat together at my desk, papers pushed aside, our knees almost touching. I felt oddly nervous, aware of every movement, the way I tucked a stray hair behind my ear, the brush of his sleeve as he handed me a pen. The conversation wandered, as if neither of us wanted to speak directly about anything real. Office politics, favorite authors, the unpredictability of spring weather. Beneath it all, though, was a subtle current, a mutual awareness, a question neither of us voiced. At one point, he asked, "Do you ever wish you could just leave everything and start over?" The question struck me, sudden and raw. I shook my head, searching for something light to say. What would I even do with myself? He smiled, eyes intent. Maybe just be. That word lingered between us, thickening the silence. I realized then how little I remembered about simply being, how every day was built around others, around the needs and habits of a life I'd grown so used to, I could barely see it anymore. He stood to leave, but paused beside me. His hand brushed my shoulder, deliberate yet gentle. I looked up, our eyes locking in a moment too honest to ignore. He bent forward slightly, his breath warm on my cheek. My pulse jumped. Every cell in my body snapped to attention, skin hypersensitive to even the suggestion of his touch. For an instant, I could smell his cologne. Wood, citrus, something deeper. Then quietly, his lips touched mine. It was brief, so light I questioned if it really happened, but the shock of it moved through me like current. He drew back, not apologizing, not explaining, just searching my face as if to read my answer. I didn't recoil. I didn't run. I felt a jolt of clarity, the sharpness of wanting, long forgotten. The warmth of his mouth, the certainty in his eyes, these sensations haunted me long after he left the room. I lingered, alone, replaying that kiss over and over as if trying to memorize each detail. The way his fingers grazed my jaw, the hint of restraint in his posture, the surge of heat in my chest that had nothing to do with shame. My hand trembled as I gathered my things, nerves humming beneath my skin. On the way home, the city felt transformed. Every streetlight, every distant horn seemed charged with possibility. I caught my reflection in the window of the taxi, cheeks flushed, eyes alive in a way I hadn't seen in years. At home, I was quiet, careful not to wake my husband as I slipped off my clothes. I chose a set of new lingerie I'd bought weeks ago on a whim, something lacy and light blue, and let the fabric remind me I was still capable of feeling. Lying beside my husband, I felt both close and galaxies apart. He mumbled something in his sleep, his hand brushing my hip. I closed my eyes, unsure if the longing in me was for his touch or for the memory of someone else's lips. In the darkness, I let the afterglow of the kiss settle into my bones, a secret ember. I didn't regret it. I wanted more. And in that wanting, I felt dangerously, exhilaratingly alive. The next day unfolded as if nothing had happened, yet the world felt charged, every moment sharper, each sound amplified. I moved through my morning as usual. Shower, soft robe wrapped tight, breakfast set with mechanical precision, but my hands shook when I poured my coffee. My husband, in his quiet way, noticed my unease. He glanced up from his phone, brow furrowed. "Are you okay?" he asked, voice flat with concern, but not curiosity. I nodded, not trusting myself to say more, focusing on the pattern the milk made as it swirled in my cup. At work, the rhythm was relentless. Meetings blurred into one another, the office thick with deadlines and unspoken resentments. I was conscious of every movement, every glance. My boss and I didn't speak beyond work-related necessities, but I felt his presence in the way our eyes would almost meet and then slide away, in how he lingered a little too long by my desk, in the electric hush that hovered when we found ourselves alone in the elevator. No one else seemed to notice. Or maybe they did, but chose to ignore it. That day I wore a pale blouse, the softest one I owned, with delicate lace at the collar, a secret for myself, a shield, a promise. My head swam with memories of the night before. My lips still tingled. I caught myself replaying every detail, and every time I saw him, my breath quickened. It wasn't love. It wasn't romance, not yet. But it was something new. A dangerous curiosity. A hunger I couldn't rationalize away. Late that afternoon, an email arrived. A request to join him on a business trip the following week. Just the two of us. A site visit out of town. Perfectly routine. Perfectly justifiable. Still, my stomach clenched as I read it. I typed my reply. "Of course. Let me know the details." My fingers hesitated over the send button, as if a single word might tip the balance of my entire life. I pressed it anyway, feeling the weight of inevitability settle over me. I spent the evening at home, in a fog. My husband worked late. I prepared dinner, the clatter of pots and pans echoing in the empty kitchen. I set the table for two, lighting a single candle, even though I knew it would burn alone for hours. When he came home, tired and distracted, he offered a smile and a peck on my cheek before disappearing into his study with a plate of food. I watched him go, the back of his head framed by the soft glow of his computer. The distance between us had become a room full of silence. I lingered, in the living room, legs curled under me on the sofa, trying to read, to distract myself. But my mind drifted. What would it be like, being away from home, sharing space with my boss where nothing felt ordinary? I imagined choosing what to pack, which nightgown to take, nothing too obvious, but nothing too modest either. I wondered what he would notice, if he would notice. The thought made my skin flush with anticipation and guilt in equal measure. The day before the trip, I found myself in a boutique, running my hands over silk and linen, choosing a blouse in a deep autumnal green and a new set of lingerie. Lace, understated but unmistakably sensual. At home, I hid the purchase beneath my regular clothes, feeling both childish and strangely powerful. My husband asked if I needed anything for the trip. "No, I'm fine," I said, forcing a smile, watching his eyes scan my face for some sign. Any sign that things were changing. The morning we left, the city was wrapped in pale fog. I packed quickly, folding each item with care. My husband helped carry my suitcase to the door. He kissed my forehead, holding me a moment longer than usual, his hands warm and steady. For a brief second, I wanted to tell him everything, not just the truth about the night at the office, but about the emptiness, the ache I couldn't fill. Instead, I thanked him, stepped outside, and let the door close behind me. In the taxi, my phone vibrated. A message from my boss, confirming the itinerary and offering to pick up coffee on the way. I replied with a single word, Black. My heartbeat wild and fast, my body attuned to the sense of something beginning. At the train station, he greeted me with a quiet smile and a paper cup, steam curling between our hands as we stood side by side. There was nothing extraordinary in his greeting, nothing in our conversation to betray what pulsed just beneath the surface. And yet, as the train slid out of the city and fields blurred past, I watched his reflection in the glass, our knees nearly touching, and wondered what boundaries would be crossed by the time we returned. As dusk crept across the landscape, our voices softened, stories drifting toward the edges of confession. He spoke of old regrets, of choices that shaped him. I listened, absorbing his tone, the tremor that sometimes slipped into his voice. He asked, "What are you most afraid of?" I considered the question, searching for an answer that felt true. "I'm afraid I'll never feel alive again," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. For a moment, I thought he would take my hand, but he only nodded, understanding in the lines around his eyes. The train carried us further from home, and as the lights of the city faded, I pressed my palm to the cold glass, feeling the vibration beneath my skin. I didn't know what the next day would bring, only that something in me had already shifted, that I was on a path I could no longer unchoose. And as the darkness deepened outside, I realized that, for the first time in years, I was looking forward to what came next, wherever it might lead. The hotel was perched at the edge of a quiet city, one of those places that always seemed to exist in soft focus, a landscape of muted streetlights and old cobblestone. We arrived just before midnight, the lobby humming with the faint notes of a jazz piano and the rustle of business travelers making their way to rooms or bars. My boss and I exchanged a glance as the desk clerk handed us our keys. Adjoining rooms, as dictated by office protocol, yet the closeness felt almost intimate in its own way. I unpacked in silence, laying out each piece of clothing with deliberate care. The green blouse I'd bought, the soft gray skirt, the new lingerie, details that only I knew, but which seemed to shape the energy in the room. I stared at my reflection in the bathroom mirror, watching the way anticipation changed the line of my mouth, the curve of my neck. I ran my hands through my hair, imagining his fingers there instead. The air felt thick, charged with the promise of something I hadn't dared articulate, even to myself. In the morning, we met in the hotel's small cafe for breakfast. Sunlight, spilling through high windows, painting patterns on the linen tablecloths. Our conversation stayed, at first, strictly professional. Timelines, client expectations, reminders about the day's meetings. But there was a subtle warmth to his tone, a lingering softness in the way he said my name. We lingered longer than necessary over coffee, the minutes stretching, neither of us in a hurry to break the spell. After our meetings, we wandered the city, maps and schedules forgotten. The streets wound between old brick buildings, small galleries, and riverbanks rimmed with willow trees. The day was cool and bright, and for a time we were simply two people, out of office roles, walking side by side. At a tiny bookshop, he found a volume of poetry and pressed it into my hands with a sly smile. "For when you need to remember this trip," he said. I felt my cheeks flush as I thanked him, tucking the book into my bag as if it were a secret. We stopped at a cafe by the river for lunch, the breeze fluttering the tablecloth, glasses chiming faintly. Conversation drifted. He told me about his first job, the mistakes he'd made, the loneliness that haunted his successes. I listened, sometimes offering my own stories, but mostly letting his words fill the spaces where my own uncertainties lived. There was a vulnerability in his admissions, a self-deprecating humor that made me want to lean closer, to confess my own fears. "Do you ever wonder if you made the right choices?" he asked, gazing at the water. "All the time," I answered, letting my voice float into the gentle hush around us. As the afternoon faded, we found ourselves back at the hotel, both of us quiet, as if afraid to break whatever fragile understanding we'd built. I showered and dressed slowly for dinner, selecting the lingerie with trembling hands, savoring the contrast of silk against skin. My dress clung to me, simple but elegant, with a neckline that revealed just enough to remind me I was more than the sum of my obligations. Dinner was a long, winding conversation in a restaurant dimly lit and intimate. The world outside faded, replaced by the sound of his laughter, the warmth of his gaze. He told a story about his father, about loss, and the way he rebuilt his life from the pieces. I spoke of the ache of routines, the comfort and confinement, of predictability, the fear of waking up and realizing you've slept through the most important years of your own existence. Our hands brushed on the table, a slow, accidental touch that neither of us hurried to end. He traced invisible patterns across my wrist, and I felt my pulse skip. We left the restaurant in comfortable silence, walking slowly back through empty streets, the city now softened by night. At the hotel doors, we paused. He looked at me, searching my face for an answer I couldn't give in words. In the hallway, our rooms waited, keys heavy in my palm. He spoke quietly, just above a whisper. "You make me remember what hope feels like." I hesitated, heart pounding, and replied, "You make me remember what it's like to be seen." For a long moment, we stood close, the world narrowing to the space between us. He didn't reach for me, not yet, but the electricity was unmistakable. When I finally entered my room, the air still hummed with his presence. I sat on the edge of the bed, legs trembling, the book of poetry in my lap. I leafed through the pages, searching for a line to steady myself. But my mind was a storm. His voice, his hand, the way my body remembered the brush of his lips, and a longing that left me sleepless. Lying awake, I listened to the slow rhythm of distant traffic, the lonely click of the elevator down the hall. I ached for the courage to knock on his door, to bridge the last inches of distance between us, but I couldn't move. Instead, I let myself feel the hunger, the hope, and the fear, all tangled together, alive beneath my skin, refusing to let me rest. By morning, I knew that I'd crossed a boundary, even if I hadn't touched him again. And the worst part was, I wasn't sure I wanted to go back. Morning crept into the room in slow gradients of gray and gold. The city below was still half asleep, and for a while I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, letting my thoughts unravel into a knot of longing and regret. I had barely slept, the air thick with unsaid words and the memory of his hand on my wrist. I watched the dust motes swirl in the shaft of sunlight, counting my breaths, reminding myself that today we would go home, that everything would return to normal. But I knew, even before I moved, that it was a lie. I showered slowly, letting the water run over my skin until it turned pink. I wore the new lingerie beneath a simple blouse and jeans, brushing my hair until it gleamed. I kept thinking of last night, the way his eyes found mine across candlelight, the silence in the hallway, the ache in my chest that felt so old and so new at the same time. I wanted to see him again, to feel the tension that sparked every time we drew near. My hands trembled as I fastened my necklace, as if I were setting a trap for my own heart. We met in the cafe again, the same table by the window. He arrived carrying 2 coffees, one black for me, one with cream for himself. The small familiarity made my throat tighten. We talked about the agenda for the morning, a few meetings, a short site visit, the train back in the afternoon. He looked tired, but not in a way that begged for sympathy. It was the kind of tired that comes from anticipation, from wrestling with decisions that have no easy answers. The meetings blurred. I sat through them with half my mind elsewhere, the other half acutely aware of his presence at my side. The brush of his jacket as he leaned in to show me a note, the warmth of his hand resting, almost carelessly, on the table. At lunch, he suggested we walk by the river one last time before leaving. I agreed, telling myself it was harmless, a way to say goodbye to the city, to the strange freedom it had lent us. The riverside was nearly empty, just a few early spring tourists and the hush of water against stone. We found a bench in a quiet alcove, hidden from the path by a screen of willows. He sat close, our knees almost touching. We talked at first about work and family, safe topics, rehearsed answers. But then the conversation drifted. He asked about my favorite childhood memory, and I told him about summer nights, bare feet in grass, the world full of possibility. He told me about the time he failed spectacularly at something important, and how it remade him, left him less certain but more alive. The silence grew, deepened, thick with all the things we couldn't say. He turned to me, voice low. "Is it wrong that I want this?" I didn't answer. I couldn't. The question hung between us, heavy and electric. He reached out, his fingers tracing the back of my hand. I felt the shiver start at my wrist and ripple up my arm. My pulse raced, and suddenly I was aware of every part of myself. How I was sitting, how my chest rose and fell, how my body ached to be seen and wanted. His hand cupped my cheek, his thumb stroking the hollow beneath my eye. I closed my eyes, felt his breath mingle with mine, and when his lips touched me this time, it was nothing like the first. No hesitation, no apology, only a fierce, quiet certainty. The world fell away. The noise of the city, the risk, the ache of guilt. There was only the heat of his mouth, the press of his body, the sharp, bright ache of finally surrendering to what we both wanted. We pulled apart slowly, reluctantly, his hands lingering at my waist, my fingers curled into the fabric of his shirt. I opened my eyes and found his searching mine, asking questions I still couldn't answer. We sat like that for a long moment, the sun warm on our faces, the river running silent beside us. The walk back was a blur, his hand at the small of my back, the world shimmering as if I were moving through water. At the hotel, we packed our things, our words few and careful, the air full of things that might never be spoken. On the train, we sat side by side, close but not touching, our reflections merging in the glass. Back in the city, we parted with a nod and a look, the promise of more glimmering in the space between us. At home, I unpacked in silence, folding the new lingerie and blouse as if they were evidence. My husband greeted me at the door, his arms around me, his lips on my forehead. I let him hold me, let the comfort of his embrace settle over me. But deep down, I was somewhere else, by the river, beneath the willows, tasting the memory of a kiss that refused to fade. That night, as I lay in our bed, I realized I didn't want to escape the ache. I wanted to feel it, wanted to burn, to tremble, to know I was still alive. And as the darkness gathered in the corners of our room, I knew that the next time I saw him, it would not be enough. The hunger was awake now, and it would not let me go. The days that followed returned me to my old routines, but something essential had shifted beneath the surface. My body remembered every stolen moment by the river, the heat of his hands, the taste of his certainty. I found myself replaying our last kiss in the privacy of my own mind, tracing its outline with my fingertips in the darkness. My husband noticed, in his quiet way, that I was changed. He watched me with puzzled affection, searching for the thread that had come loose between us. I could feel his worry, his efforts to reach me. Small offerings, a cup of coffee in the morning, a gentle squeeze of my hand before bed. But the distance remained, a thin pane of glass I could see through but never touch. One evening, after a long day at work, I returned home to the smell of garlic and fresh herbs. My husband was in the kitchen, humming softly as he chopped vegetables, a bottle of wine breathing on the counter. I hesitated at the threshold, watching him work, feeling both gratitude and guilt. The table was set for two, candles burning low. He smiled when he saw me, and for a moment, I almost convinced myself that nothing had changed, that I could step back into the life I had always known. Dinner passed in gentle conversation, plans for the weekend, stories from his day, small, jokes that made me laugh more out of habit than joy. I could sense him reaching for me, trying to find the woman I used to be. After we cleared the dishes, he took my hand and led me to the living room, the flicker of the fireplace casting shadows across the walls. He sat beside me on the couch, his arm slipping around my shoulders, pulling me close. There was a tenderness to his touch, a familiar warmth that once brought comfort. He leaned in, his lips brushing my temple, then my cheek, finally finding my mouth. I kissed him back, but there was a carefulness to it, a restraint that had not always been there. He noticed, pulling away slightly to search my face. "Are you happy?" he asked, voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know," I replied, the truth slipping out before I could catch it. He looked at me, eyes soft with worry. "I want you to be." "I know," I said, my voice small. "I'm trying." He stroked my hair, his fingers gentle, and I wanted to want him. I wanted to feel the old hunger, the wildness we'd shared when we were younger. But all I could feel was the ghost of another touch, the echo of a longing I could not bring myself to confess. We made love that night, if it could be called that. I tried to lose myself in sensation, in the rhythm of bodies moving together. But my mind wandered, searching for a spark that would not come. I watched the way his shoulders moved, the curve of his back, the earnestness of his desire, and I felt a deep, aching tenderness for him, a gratitude that almost broke me. But beneath it, there was a hollowness, a sense of absence that no amount of closeness could fill. Afterward, we lay side by side, our breathing slow and synchronized. He reached for my hand, threading his fingers through mine. I closed my eyes, listening to the sound of his heart, the steady beat that had been my comfort for so many years. I wondered what he would do if he knew, if he sensed how far I had drifted, how much of me was already gone. In the days that followed, I tried to bridge the gap, to reclaim some piece of what we'd lost. I dressed with care, choosing soft fabrics and warm colors, lingering over the selection of lingerie in the mornings, hoping that attention to detail might awaken something inside me. I cooked his favorite meals, left notes on his pillow, laughed at his jokes even when I didn't find them funny. But the more I tried, the more artificial it felt, as if I were playing a role in a life I no longer recognized. At work, my boss and I maintained a careful distance. Our emails were clipped, our meetings brief. But the tension simmered beneath the surface, a silent conversation carried out in glances and the accidental brush of fingers. I caught him watching me in the reflection of a window, his gaze lingering just long enough to set my pulse racing. We never spoke of what had happened, but it colored every interaction, every word exchanged in the presence of others. One afternoon, as I was leaving the office, I found a small note tucked beneath my keyboard. 3 words, written in his hand. "I miss us." I pressed the slip of paper to my chest, feeling its weight settle deep inside me. That night, as I lay awake beside my husband, I realized that something irretrievable had been lost between us. Not just the spark of passion, but the quiet intimacy of knowing and being known. I had crossed a line I could not uncross, and the ache of that knowledge kept me company long into the dark. I wondered how many more nights would pass before I found the courage to choose a path, even if it meant leaving someone I once loved behind. It was a Thursday afternoon when the world I'd so carefully balanced began to tip. The office felt tighter than usual, air thick with rumors and the static tension of overworked colleagues. I'd grown skilled at navigating these currents, keeping my expression neutral, letting the day carry me from one meeting to the next. But that day I could sense a change, a subtle shift in how people looked at me, conversations that seemed to hush when I entered the break room, glances exchanged behind raised coffee cups. It was as if some invisible line had been crossed, though no one said it outright. I tried to ignore it, burying myself in spreadsheets and reports, answering emails with brisk efficiency. But I couldn't shake the feeling that eyes were on me, watching, weighing every gesture. My boss maintained the usual professional distance, but I caught the flicker of concern in his eyes when our gazes met. A silent question I didn't know how to answer. We spoke only of work, but his voice was softer than usual, his instructions peppered with careful pauses. Late in the afternoon, as I gathered my things to leave, a colleague approached. One I'd always thought of as harmlessly nosy, a chronic observer of office intrigue. She lingered by my desk, rifling through a stack of papers, her tone light but her words pointed. "You and the boss have been working closely lately, haven't you?" she remarked, too casually. I shrugged, forcing a smile. "Big project. You know how it is." She nodded, but I saw the suspicion in her eyes, the hint of satisfaction at having struck a nerve. As she walked away, I realized how thin my facade had become. On the way home, I replayed the encounter in my mind, heart pounding with anxiety and something close to defiance. I knew I should be more careful, avoid private conversations, keep my distance, erase any trace of intimacy from my behavior. But the truth was, the risk only heightened my desire. There was a perverse thrill in knowing I could be discovered, in the way our secret colored everything around me. Every look, every half-smile exchanged with my boss became its own language, charged with meaning no one else could decipher. That evening, my husband sensed my distraction. He tried to draw me out, asking about my day, making gentle jokes, reaching for my hand across the dinner table. I answered in half-sentences, my mind elsewhere, guilt creeping in like a cold draft beneath the door. After dinner, he sat beside me on the couch, his arm around my shoulders, eyes searching my face for a truth he couldn't quite name. "Is there something you want to talk about?" he asked softly. I hesitated, pulse quickening. "No, just tired," I lied, forcing a smile that felt brittle in my mouth. He watched me for a moment longer, then nodded, accepting my answer even as he sensed the distance growing between us. The silence that followed was dense with things unsaid. That night I couldn't sleep. I tossed and turned, thoughts racing in frantic circles. I thought of my boss, his hand at the small of my back, the stolen note he'd left for me, the way his eyes lingered when he thought no one was watching. I remembered the river, the ache of our last kiss, the hunger that refused to fade. The next morning, as I dressed for work, I hesitated over my choice of clothes. I settled on a deep blue blouse and a skirt that hugged my hips just enough, slipping on the same lingerie I'd worn in the hotel, a small act of rebellion, a way of holding on to the version of myself I only revealed in his presence. At the office, whispers seemed louder, laughter sharper, every conversation a minefield. I kept my head down, tried to lose myself in the rhythm of the day. But at lunch, I caught my boss's eye across the cafeteria, a look that lingered, that promised more than words ever could. After work, he found me in the parking garage, the echo of our footsteps filling the empty space. He leaned against my car, arms crossed, face shadowed, but intent. "We have to be more careful," he said quietly. "People are starting to notice." "I know," I replied, the words heavy with longing. He stepped closer, his voice barely more than a whisper. "I don't want to lose this." "Neither do I admitted, the admission trembling between us like a held breath. He touched my hand, just for a moment, brief, electric, a promise made without words. Then he was gone, swallowed by the shadows, and I was left standing in the silence, heart pounding with equal parts fear and desire. Driving home, I realized I was moving closer to a precipice I could no longer ignore. The secret I'd tried to hide had grown too large, threatening to spill over into every corner of my life. And yet, I knew I would not turn back. The danger, the thrill, the ache of wanting, it was all too much to resist. I was caught in the current now, pulled forward by a force I could neither name nor deny, waiting for the moment when everything would break. The tension in my life became almost unbearable, an undercurrent that hummed through every waking moment and shadowed my dreams. I found myself waking early, heart already racing, anxiety prickling across my skin before my feet even touched the floor. At breakfast, I moved through the rituals of marriage with a kind of numb expertise. Toast, coffee, a passing kiss on the cheek, each gesture more practiced than felt. My husband tried in his own quiet way to draw me back. He suggested a weekend away, a drive out of the city, something to remind us of what we once had. I nodded, murmured agreement, but the prospect only filled me with dread. I knew I was drifting farther from him every day, and the effort to pretend otherwise had become exhausting. At work, my boss and I no longer tried to pretend that our connection was just professional. There were no more notes, no more secret messages. Everything between us was wordless, crackling in the space between us, spoken in lingering glances, in the way his hand would brush my arm when no one was looking. I began to crave even the smallest of those touches, the briefest moments when I could forget the boundaries that still held us apart. Then one evening he called. His voice was low, urgent, stripped of the usual careful distance. "Can we talk?" I hesitated, knowing what was really being asked, but the longing was stronger than my fear. We met in a quiet bar far from the office, slipping into a booth in the shadowy back corner. The world outside seemed to fade away, the noise of other patrons dull and far off. I watched the way his hands trembled as he cradled his glass. He confessed he hadn't been sleeping either, that he thought of me constantly, that he felt trapped in the same web of guilt and desire. He asked, almost pleading, like, "What are we going to do?" I stared at the condensation running down my wine glass, searching for an answer. "I don't know," I whispered, "but I can't stop." His hand found mine beneath the table, fingers entwining with mine in a gesture that was both desperate and tender. I felt the ache of it in my chest, the shiver of something close to hope and terror entwined. We left together, walking in silence to the lot where his car was parked. The city lights flickered on wet pavement, and for a moment I wanted to keep walking, to disappear into the night and never return. He reached for me, pulling me gently into his arms. I pressed my face to his shoulder, feeling the world narrow to the sound of his heartbeat. His lips found mine, and the kiss was not urgent or frantic, but slow, deliberate, a silent confession of everything we couldn't say aloud. It lingered, left us both unsteady. He offered to drive me home, but I shook my head, not trusting myself to be near him any longer. We stood in the hush of the empty parking lot, two adults caught in a storm of their own making. "I wish things were different," he said softly. "Me too," I replied, and the words felt like a surrender. At home, I moved like a ghost through my own rooms. My husband was asleep, the house wrapped in a hush broken only by the distant hum of traffic. I undressed in the dark, feeling the chill of the night settle against my skin. I lay awake, the memory of his arms around me a brand I could not wash away. The following days became a blur of obligations. Work, home, dinner with friends, each event another performance. My boss and I kept our distance in public, but every so often our eyes would meet, and I'd see the same hunger, the same confusion mirrored back at me. My husband grew more anxious, sensing my withdrawal but unable to name its cause. He became more attentive, planning small surprises, leaving notes by my coffee cup in the morning. His kindness twisted inside me, feeding my guilt, but I couldn't reach him. One evening, as I folded laundry in the bedroom, he came in and stood quietly, watching me for a long moment. "Are you in love with someone else?" he asked suddenly. The question, so direct and naked, stunned me. I stared at the socks in my hands, unable to answer. The silence between us was absolute. When I finally looked up, his face was pale and tired, his eyes searching mine for the woman he'd known. "I don't want to lose you," he said, voice rough. I set the socks aside, my hands trembling. "I don't know what I want anymore," I admitted, the truth spilling out, raw and unvarnished. We talked long into the night, words tumbling out, angry and sad and searching. He asked me if there was a chance for us. I didn't know how to answer. I saw how much pain I'd caused, the depth of his fear and confusion, and I felt a sharp pang of regret. But there was no clarity, no easy solution. Only the knowledge that I could no longer keep living divided, torn between longing and loyalty, honesty and secrecy. I lay awake beside him until dawn, listening to his breathing, wondering what would happen if I chose the unknown, if I stepped fully into the darkness I'd created. I knew a decision was coming. I could feel its weight pressing down on me. And as the first light seeped through the window, I realized that whatever happened next, nothing in my life would ever be simple again. Morning brought with it a clarity. I hadn't expected a kind of painful lucidity that made the world seem both sharper and more fragile. The sunlight traced the patterns on our bedroom wall, and I lay still, listening to the slow, careful breathing of the man beside me. For a moment, I almost believed I could choose to return to who I had been, gather up the broken pieces of our marriage, and start again. But the truth lingered at the edge of every thought. I had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed, and the ache of that crossing was now part of me. I moved through the motions of the morning, coffee brewing, toast browning, the clatter of plates on the table. My husband joined me, face lined with exhaustion, the silence between us thick and raw. There was kindness in his gestures, but every small mercy only deepened the guilt I carried, pressing on my chest like a stone. We exchanged a few gentle words, both avoiding the real conversation we'd had the night before. He offered to drive me to work, and I accepted, our drive punctuated by long silences and the familiar landscape sliding past, unchanged by our turmoil. At the office, I felt the weight of every glance. The walls of routine had been breached. Nothing was private anymore. My boss greeted me with a cautious nod, his eyes flickering with questions I couldn't answer here. The day dragged on, each task an anchor. I responded to emails, answered questions, made calls. On the surface, everything appeared as it always had. But beneath it all, I felt the tension mounting, the inevitability of something breaking. Around midday, as I sorted through a pile of paperwork, my boss appeared at my desk. He handed me a small wrapped package, plain paper, no card. I looked at him, uncertain, and he only said, "Later." The package sat on my desk all afternoon, an unspoken promise or threat. I couldn't decide which. At home that evening, my husband was waiting. I saw it in his eyes the moment I walked in. The resolve, the decision made. He asked me to sit, his hands folded tightly in his lap. There was a tremor in his voice as he spoke, not of accusations, but of grief. The sorrow of a man who had loved and lost without knowing how or why. He asked the questions he needed to ask, and for the first time, I answered honestly. I spoke of loneliness, of longing, of the way I had tried to hold on, even as I slipped away. He listened, silent, tears bright in his eyes but unshed. When I finished, he asked, "Is it over?" The question was impossible. I shook my head, unable to lie. The room felt too small, the air too thin. We sat together for a long time, the space between us filled with all the words we'd never learned to say. That night, I slept alone in the guest room, the ache of absence settling over me like a second skin. I held the package from my boss, hands trembling as I opened it. Inside was the book of poetry he'd given me on our trip, but this time a note was tucked inside. "No matter what you choose, you are not invisible. You are alive." I traced the words with my finger, a rush of gratitude and grief flooding me. Days passed in a blur of practicalities, discussions about what to do next, dividing up the spaces of our life together, the uncertain negotiations of endings. My husband was gentle, wounded, his kindness making the pain sharper. We did not fight. There were no accusations, no rage. Just two people, exhausted by sorrow, trying to say goodbye to the world they had built. At work, my boss offered comfort, but it was different now, quieter, less urgent. The thrill of secrecy was gone, replaced by a tentative honesty. We met after hours once, walking by the river where everything had started. We talked, not of the future, but of the present, of wounds, of survival, of what it meant to be truly seen. I am alone now in a small apartment with bare walls and sunlight that falls across the floor in the early morning. I think of my husband often, of the life we shared and the ways we failed each other. I think of my boss, and of the desire that tore through everything I thought I knew about myself. Mostly, I think about the strange freedom of starting over, about the ache that comes with honesty, about what it means to finally be visible, even in the emptiest of rooms. Sometimes the longing still comes, late at night, in the hush between dreams, an ache for the certainty of a life I can never return to. But I know now that I am more than what I lost. I am more than what I gave up. In the quiet, I am finally learning how to live with the consequences of desire, and in their shadow I am beginning piece by piece to find myself again.